This is Modern Political Philosophy for Wednesday, March 9th, that I missed because of illness. So actually, this recording is for that class, and then I'll follow up yesterday's class on Friday with our continuing examination of the Discourse on Method. The materials for this I've already passed out. One, what I'm going to be speaking about right now, is from this handwritten sheet called The Unfolding of Modernity, which I hope will be useful as we move through several of these authors. And my purpose in covering this material is to make clear some of the approaches that Descartes takes in the Discourse on Method, and how he sees the development of a new kind of science, a practical, methodical, universal science, will be the at least the initial solution to the problems of the human condition. And then I'll continue with the notes that I passed out yesterday on Friday, and again I'll append these materials to the email with the link to this video. So if you're looking at The Unfolding of Modernity, the handwritten sheet, here's some basic things I want to walk through. We've talked a little bit about this, but this is, I think, particularly useful for how both Bacon and Descartes understood the role and place of a new science. So the old world, because as I suggested yesterday in class, the Discourse on Method, the 6 parts of the Discourse on Method are kind of a transition or a transformation. Especially the part 1, the old world and the old science, and then the 6th part 6, the new world, the new science and the new world. And you'll see that the new science that Descartes is proposing is a correction to both the deficiencies of the old human world, including the political world, the religious world, the cultural world, the economic world, but also is a corrective to the problem of the old science. And you'll see that the old science, the science of Plato and Aristotle and the ancient philosophers, and mathematicians, as you'll see, and indeed, when we start working through the Discourse on Method, the 11 sciences that form part of the curriculum that Descartes refers to as his intellectual background, the defect of the old world was the same defect of the new world. Let me go. The defect of the old science was the same defect as the old human world. The very evidence of the defective character of the human world as it existed and the old science as it existed was its lack of agreement, its diversity, its inability to come to an agreement about anything. And you'll see that's both politically, religiously, culturally, and so we can work back to the core defect this way. So the problem is the old human mind and the old human condition. Again, the very evidence of it being defective was that it was so divided, so divisive, that humanity was a competing mess of camps, of religious, cultural camps, and that the old science was a competing mess of philosophic ideas from one philosopher or another, all of which never really ascended beyond the realm of opinion. And the defect in both really stemmed from a tendency of the human mind to believe things true that were doubtful. In other words, a kind of a loss of self-consciousness about the tenuousness of all. In fact, it will turn out, all of our inner mental life, with the exception, as we'll see, of the one phrase, "I think, therefore I am," where Descartes just isn't being cute or setting himself up for some bad bar jokes later on, but really thinks that the proper place to begin is what the human mind can actually know. So the great defect of most of human society and human science or philosophy was that human beings thought they knew something they didn't know, and that therefore the only way to clear away the manure of human life and human intellectual life, practical and theoretical life, is to start with the acid of radical doubt. And So, just to begin with at the top of the sheet, and this is the old word pre-1500. So politically and culturally, you'd have to say that when you looked at the human being, there was a mixture of religious absolutism, not just the Western world from the Bible, but in all the human condition. And it wasn't just religious absolutism, where one religion considered itself to be in position of absolute truth, when in reality its faith statements were as questionable as any other doubtful statement. But that of course, most human governments were totalitarian, and that even includes ancient democracies like Athens and republics like Rome, where atheism or not believing in the gods was a crime. So you'd have to say politically and culturally, the political world was dominated by royal aristocracies and oligarchies that tended to reinforce. So princes and priests sort of reinforced the rule of each other. The priests blessed the rule of the absolute princes or ruling classes, and the ruling classes supported the religious beliefs of the priesthood. So the idea of a separation of church and state, which will emerge from the works that we're going to be reading this semester, and that find their first embodiment in the United States of America, that just simply didn't exist politically or culturally. Moreover, when you looked at the human condition from the very beginning, it would be an understatement to say that one of these armed religious camps called nations or countries has been at war with all others. So war, the political, religious, and cultural history of humanity is endless strife and fighting about things that can't be proved anyway. So, and this is, and again, Descartes will make you aware of this in part one, because he autobiographically lets you know that where he is when he got the idea for the discourse, or for the method, was sitting in a small room heated by a small stove, La Poêle, during the 30 Years' War, which of course was the war in which Europe tore itself apart of Protestantism versus Catholicism. So the mess of the human condition, politically, culturally, and religiously, is conflict, division, asserting things that can't be known, and with humanity paying the price. And we'll see what that price is. Well, one general price, by the way, is because humanity is so screwed up and constantly at war and praying to gods whose existence can't be proved, that we're also the general victim of nature: floods, earthquakes, diseases, and everything. So, as we'll see, as we unfold the actual condition of humanity, goes from bad to worse. So, economically, how did most human beings live from the very emergence of human beings from the swamp? Well, you'd have to say the vast majority of human beings, 90 to 95%, were subsistence farmers. All along, depending on the civilization, this is both east and west, north and south, there was some trade and commerce, some large cities. This is true of the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Chinese, and the rise of civilization roughly 5,000 years ago, 5 to 7,000 years ago, and then the rise of large cities and urban centers about 3,000 years ago. And there was trade, and up through the ancient and medieval world, professional guilds, different craftsmen, etc. But you'd have to say that most human beings who weren't princes, aristocrats, priests, were pious peasants, born into crushing poverty and dying in crushing poverty, amidst disease, oppression, etc. Intellectually, the West, you'd have to say that with the rise of the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance in the 13 to 1500s, but even before then, you'd have to say that the Greek and Roman philosophic world was the authoritative intellectual world for Westerners, and not just Christians, by the way. This was true of Jews and Muslims. With the rediscovery of, well, first of all, here's just a little bit of intellectual history. The works of Plato and Aristotle were generally lost to the West with the fall of the Roman Empire and the Dark Ages, and it was in the Eastern Roman Empire, which actually survives until 1457. I mean, we believe that the fall of the Western Roman Empire was the fall of Rome, and so it was. But actually, what happened to the Roman Empire was it split into two, and eventually the West crumbled and was taken over by the Vandals, toilet papering the mailboxes of the Romans, but the eastern part, based in Constantinople, survived until the Turkish and Muslim takeover, and its name was changed from Constantinople to Istanbul, which is an Arabic version of the Greek word Eistenpolin, into the city when the invaders invaded the city and took it over, and it became Istanbul. And the word, by the way, the word for what we call the Byzantine Empire was actually in Arabic was Rum, or Rome. It was the Roman Empire. So in some ways, the works of Aristotle and Plato survived in Greek and were translated into Arabic by Jews, actually. So Jews became the kind of interesting transmitter of Greek political ideas and philosophy. And within the Arabic world, Arush, Averroes, and the Jewish world, Maimonides. But then in the Christian world, Aquinas became the great Christian, Jewish, and Muslim Aristotelians. So Aristotle, as we're going to see, was the great intellectual authority that needed to be overthrown. In the works of Bacon, Descartes, and Hobbes, when we turn to Leviathan, you'll see that the Leviathan both imitates and repudiates Aristotle's ethical and political teaching in its layout and structure. It's both an imitation and a refutation of Aristotle's I just repeated myself. With the Dark Ages, by the way, the barriers of intellectual tradition in the West were actually the monasteries until the rise of the universities. And interestingly enough, Ireland became one of the main repositories of Western learning during the monasteries of the Dark Ages. But in 1300, the University of Paris was formed, and so the curriculum that Descartes describes in part 1 of the Discourse on Method is essentially the curriculum of the European University. I'm sorry, I have the actual date of the founding of the University of Paris is 1150. Now, here's a little bit of immediate background of Machiavelli and his successors. Don't forget the Renaissance again, with the rediscovery, the rebirth of classical learning, and the rise of grammar and the study of languages. That's important, as we're going to see, for biblical criticism in a minute. I mentioned this in class yesterday. But there is a certain sense in which there was a certain freeing up of a certain amount of church authority. Not much, by the way, because the church was still burning people for translating the Bible into the vernacular in the century before Machiavelli, and yet you'd have to say the other major cultural background that's critical for not so much Machiavelli, but clearly for Descartes and Spinoza and Bacon and Hobbes, is the rise of the Reformation. In 1517, with Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the door of a cathedral at Wittenberg, and of course in 1536 the publication of the Institutes of the Christian Religion by Calvin, and so within the earthquake of the religious fissure that took over Europe, you'll see that these authors both created an opportunity for them to write and also gave them something to write about, because for them, you'll see, the great conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism was just a continuation of what I was mentioning earlier for Descartes, the endless war of religion against religion based on doubtful statements that could never be proven. And the more unprovable people's cultural beliefs, and by the way, not just religious beliefs like the Trinity versus Unitarianism or something like that, but also cultural beliefs, the idea that our culture is superior to another culture or something. Everyone believes his or her culture is superior to everyone else's. We think cannibalism is wrong. Just wait till you find out what you're eating at the G dining room. But again, the mess and the horror that Europe descended into with the rise of the Reformation was but the background. And so you'll see that to some degree, not only is the Reformation, with its insistence of the separation of world and church, the kind of precursor to the separation of church and state, But in some ways, the call for a reduction of the power of religion, perhaps even the destruction of religious power, and certainly the separation of religious power from political power, is partially a reaction on the part of these philosophers to the tumult that the Reformation, and indeed all religious history prior to it, had unleashed. Now, it's critical, again, to point out that the technological advance 50 years prior to Machiavelli and the Reformation, which enabled both the spread of Machiavelli's works, but also the philosophic works that we're reading in general, and also the Protestant Reformation, was the invention of the printing press in 1447. Again, I mentioned this in class several weeks ago, probably at the beginning of the semester, but this is one of my favorite factoids, that prior to the printing press in 1447, from one end of the European continent, from Lisbon to Moscow, there were perhaps 100,000 books, owned primarily by the wealthy aristocrat or by the monasteries, all hand printed, handwritten on parchment mostly, but on other materials. And 50 years later, at the beginning of the 1500s, the printing press had made possible for there to be then 15 million books. So you go from 100,000 books to 15 million books from one end of the continent to another. That's a remarkable change. And it's that technological, two things, you might say this, three things. One, it enabled the rapid dissemination of these texts. So by the time that Machiavelli published, which he circulated first the prints in hand manuscript, but they were all printed after he was died, his major works, and they flooded the continent. In fact, Shakespeare, there's evidence that Shakespeare had read Machiavelli and considers Machiavellianism. He uses the phrase Machiavel. Now, that could have been a general cultural term that Shakespeare picked up, but that's how, within 70 years, how famous Machiavelli had become towards the end of it, because Shakespeare wrote from about the 1580s to the 1605 or 8. So, so one is the availability of printed text and the rapid dissemination, which meant that it was harder to suppress text. Now, all of the books that we're reading in this semester were instantly slapped on the Catholic Church's index of prohibited books. But to slap a book on a prohibited index and actually prohibit people from having access to it is one thing. And the second thing I'd mention is the decreasing cost of books. Those 100,000 books that existed in Europe from one end of the continent to another were precious items, and that's why only the wealthy could afford them. Well, with the cost with printing, the cost of material dropped rapidly, and in some ways, with the rise of the middle classes in these centuries, not only were there more materials available, more people could afford them. And then, of course, the third thing I want to point out as a result of the Protestant Reformation is the rise of mass literacy. More people could read them. And not only because they could afford them, because they read them. Remember, mass literacy was not a general cultural expectation for most of human history. In fact, there were only two ancient civilizations where I wouldn't say the majority of the people could read, but at least more than just learned scribes, because with cuneiform or Chinese or either hieroglyphics, which were partially phonetic, those other systems of writings were mostly pictographic, which meant that only remarkably trained scribes could actually read and write. But ancient Greece and ancient Judea actually had something. First of all, they had alphabetical systems. The Canaanite Hebrew alphabet was the first alphabet in the world, which meant that to read you only had to learn 22 to 26 symbols rather than 5,000 different symbols, which is true with cuneiform and Chinese, and had somewhat expectations of mass religious and democratic literacy in Athens. But in reality, it wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that the expectation that the everyday person could read became a theological necessary, because replacing the authority of the church and sacrament, etc., with justification by faith, which is the Protestant understanding of the mechanism of salvation in Christianity, but also the idea that faith is generated by contact and reading with the Word. Whereas the Catholic Church generally tried to prohibit the translation and accessibility of the masses to the Bible for fear of misinterpretation. The Protestant Reformation insists that the masses have access to the Word, to the Bible, and therefore the expectation of mass literacy, which, by the way, was a profound factor at the time of the American founding, because America had one of the highest rates of literacy, believe it or not, in the world. So, with that as background, let's turn the page here, the second page of this, and we'll do some immediate background for Machiavelli. So Machiavelli writes The Prince in 1513, the Discourses and his other works, and they begin circulating. And so by the middle to the end of the century, the great intellects of Europe have access to Machiavelli's teaching. And you're going to see that especially with Descartes, there's actually rhetorical overlap. I think there's textual evidence that Descartes has read Machiavelli and has incorporated Machiavelli's teaching partially into his own teaching. So by the time we get to Francis Bacon, you'd have to divide the world from the French world, the English and British world, and in some ways the Jewish, Spanish, and Dutch world. So the three great figures that come to light are Francis Bacon, Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza, and René Descartes. And again, it's Descartes that we're going to focus on because, first of all, I think his influence is probably more profound, at least in terms of science. But just to touch a little bit, and we'll read a little bit of Francis Bacon in a minute, in terms of what the purpose of the new science that both Bacon and Descartes are formulating. Spinoza, it was an interesting character. Born in Spain, and his family fled to Holland, and he changed his name from Baruch to Benedict because Baruch means blessed, Benedict means blessed, and Spinoza also argued for the rise of a new science, but Spinoza's primary concentration was ethics and politics, and much of his work, the Ethics and the Theological Political Tractatus, treatise, mirrors a good deal of Hobbes's. What Spinoza's probably one of his greatest influences was in the rise of biblical criticism. Now, you're going to see Hobbes is also one of the great founders of the critical study of the Bible, and I mentioned this in class yesterday. But remember, this was a byproduct to some degree of the rise of linguistics and grammar and language studies in the Renaissance. And so what both Spinoza and, as we'll see, Hobbes does is subject the Bible to a kind of a withering criticism based on the premise that rather than being divine revelation in a single author, that you can show that the Bible has multiple authors, which can be done by linguistic scholarship and analysis. Critical textual analysis. So let's go back to Bacon and Descartes. As we're going to see, both Bacon and Descartes rebel against the dominant curriculum in the universities of that time, and call for a new kind of science. So we're up to Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626. And had published the Novum Organum and the Advancement of Learning in 1605 and 1620, and Descartes, who died in 1651. By the way, Queen Christina of Sweden had invited him to come up and be her tutor, and he didn't dress warmly and died almost instantly of pneumonia. Now, you're going to discover that that Descartes and Hobbes were actually contemporaries and actually corresponded with each other, and to some degree, whereas Descartes is known more as the formulator of the new science of modern science, Hobbes also will advocate it. But you're going to see a difference between Hobbes and Descartes is Hobbes is far more political, and in some ways, one way to understand what Hobbes is trying to do in Leviathan is to take the kind of science that Bacon, especially Descartes, formulated and literally create a new political science and a new politics based on that science. And you're going to see that's why Hobbes is so central to the unfolding of modern politics and political science. So it would be fair to say that both So let's turn to the notes now from yesterday, and we'll actually begin our examination of the Discourse on Method. But it would not be a simplification to say that for both Bacon and especially Descartes and Hobbes, the great problem of the mess of the human world was a mess of the human mind. And in fact, from the most of all the bad aspects of human life, the poverty, the oppression, the religious obscurantism, the inability of the human beings to change their condition or their place in the world, was because of a disorder in the human mind. Now, you're going to see that in some respects. That means that both. So we'll turn a little bit to Bacon and Descartes and see what they thought, what the thrust of science should be, and you're going to see the thrust of it is a practical science, not a theological or a speculative science, but rather a science whose purpose is now to give human beings power over the natural world and over themselves and ultimately the political world. Now, as you're going to see, one question we'll be asking through especially these two works, the Discourse on Method and the Leviathan, is what is science? And what is science as an aspect of the methodical or ordered mind that replaces the disorder and dysfunction of the disordered human mind? In some ways, without distorting or simplifying, you're going to see that both Descartes and Hobbes think that the problem is a sloppiness of language. And therefore, in some ways, scientific knowledge is a kind of a reformulation of human language. More about that later. So here are just two quotes, one of which we'll come back to later in our study of Descartes, if you're looking at the notes from yesterday, from Francis Bacon, from The Advancement of Learning. I'm going to have to put my artificial bifocals on here. So the greatest error, this is from 1605, the greatest error of all the rest is mistaking and misplacing of the last or farthest end of knowledge. For men have entered into a desire of learning and knowledge, sometimes upon a natural curiosity and inquisitive appetite, sometimes to entertain their minds with variety and delight, sometimes for ornament and reputation, and sometimes to enable him to victory of wit and contradiction, and most times for lucre and profession, lucre meaning profit, and seldom sincerely to give a true account of their gift of reason to the benefit and use of men. So the intellectual activity of humanity up till this point has been pretty useless, either for entertainment or for verbal wits like Socrates, or to continue with Bacon here, but pretty useless, except for making money, by the way. And as Descartes will point out in the Discourse on Method, both medicine and law are useful for making one wealthy, for getting money. As if there were sought in knowledge a couch wherein to rest a searching and restless spirit, or a terrace for a wandering and variable mind to walk up and down with a fair prospect, or a tower of state for a proud mind to raise itself upon. And by the way, you'll see in Descartes and actually in Hobbes, the motive of the old philosophers wasn't knowledge, especially useful knowledge, but pride, to make philosophers think that they were superior to the rest of humanity. And if you've read The Republic, this isn't a bad reading of The Republic, because The Republic of Plato culminates with the rule of humanity by philosopher kings, or kings who have become philosophers. So this idea that behind old philosophy, political philosophy, was actually an inappropriate motive of pride, of a way of not unlike, by the way, princely or priestly pride, where you think that you're better than your humanity. Descartes, as you're going to see, starts out with a kind of a statement of equality, the equality of the human mind in the Discourse on Method. And I think on one level he's serious about it. Although Descartes clearly thinks he's probably smarter than the rest of us too, at least he will show the rest of us how to clean up the mess in our minds. For strife and contention, or a shop for profit or sale, and not a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. So for Bacon, as you'll see for Descartes, the purpose of knowledge isn't pleasure, it isn't curiosity, even if it satisfies some of those needs, and it's certainly not philosophic pride and dispute and wit. The purpose of knowledge is to improve the human condition in the world, the relief of man's estate. Now we'll see the Cartesian version of that, and again we'll come back to this when we work through the Discourse on Method. But here's the critical statement about the purpose of a new science. And this is from the Discourse on Method, Part 6. For by them I perceive it to be possible to arrive at a knowledge highly useful in life, and in room of the speculative philosophy usually taught in the schools that he was trained in, as we'll see. Instead of that, to discover a practical, by means of which, knowing the force and action of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies, in the same way that to all the uses to which, and all the other bodies that surround us, including the material of our own bodies, as you'll see, as distinctly as we know the various crafts of our artisans, we might also apply them in the same way to all the uses to which they are adopted, and thus render ourselves the master or lords and possessors of nature. So the purpose of science is to conquer nature and subdue nature to our needs, to make ourselves master, lord, and possessor of nature. Now, it doesn't take somebody more than 2 seconds to understand that the short 3-letter word for master and possessor of nature is God. It's Descartes suggesting that through scientific knowledge, not the individual human being, but the human race may become the master of our natural condition instead of the victim of it, that we can conquer fortune using our virtue. And by the way, there you have it. This is the framework that I'm going to lay out Descartes' teaching in. That whereas at the end of The Prince, Machiavelli suggests that the real issue in human life is fortune versus virtue, fortuna versus virtù. Fortune meaning the forces of the world, what Descartes and Hobbes and the subsequent thinkers will come to call nature. That the task is human power versus a natural power, or the power of the world outside us, or the world in general. So as you're going to see, in the same way that Machiavelli says you can either be the world's victim or its master, Descartes is going to say you can either be nature's victim or its master, and what he transforms virtue, Machiavellian virtue, into is scientific knowledge. And this is a result to be desired, to continue in the long quote there, not only in order for the invention of an infinity of arts by which we might be enabled to enjoy without any trouble the fruits of the earth and all its comforts, but also and especially the preservation of health, which is doubt all the blessings of this life, the first and fundamental one. For the mind is so intimately dependent upon the conditioned relations with the organs of the body that if any means were ever to be found to render men wiser and more ingenious, I believe it is in medicine, psychopharmacology, and neurobiology to be exact. I believe it is in medicine they must be sought for. It is true that the science of medicine, as it now exists, contains few things whose utility is very remarkable. But without any wish to depreciate it, I am confident there is no one, not even among those whose profession it is, who does not admit that at all present known it is almost nothing in comparison of what remains to be discovered, and that we could free ourselves from an infinity of maladies of body as well of mind, and perhaps from the infelicity or debility, is one translation, of old age, if we had sufficiently ample knowledge of their causes and of the remedies provided for us by nature. So, you also don't have to be a biblical scholar to understand that what Descartes is talking about is overthrowing the curse of Genesis. So science will produce an infinity of devices which will render the fruits of the labor, fruits of the earth, without painful labor. If you remember, one of the two, among other curses given to humanity in the expulsion from Genesis, from the Garden of Eden, was painful labor, and then the fruits yielding them of the world yielding them up by chance or with difficult and painful labor, both for men and for women, but also death. So Descartes has rather a heavy agenda for science, and we'll see exactly what that requires and what the vision is, the new vision of instead of a human species animated by religious, cultural, and political divisions, constantly at war with itself, immersed in poverty, and the victim of nature, a universal science of method, observation, definition, measurement, and experiment can lead to a new human species, a unified human species. And you'd have to say, as we'll see, there's both in Descartes and Hobbes, there's something to this, that whatever physicists do, whether it's in Beijing, Berlin, or Washington, or any other nation of the world, the periodic table of elements is the periodic table of elements, and nuclear physics looks pretty much like nuclear physics everywhere. So Descartes' vision of a humanity now empowered with the ability to study and master nature, and perhaps even overcome its own internal physical and mental diseases, rests in the spread and the nature of the new experimental science that he will be unleashing. So if you're following along with the notes, this is what we did yesterday. I went through the structure of the discourse on method, the structure of the work, and not only did I suggest that the work goes from old to new, old world, old science, to new science, new world. The chapters themselves have a kind of a progression. In the old world and the old science, Descartes will describe, as I've already mentioned, his own circumstances serving during the 30 Years' War. But he will also, it's also an intellectual autobiography in which he lays out the curriculum, first appearing to affirm it, but then, as you're going to see, just dismantling it and deconstructing it in literally the next page. In Part 2, he actually lays out the content, the rules of scientific method, which we'll go over. In Part 3, the moral rules. Now, you could say, why do there need to be, why in a work on science and methodical thinking does there need to be a chapter on rules of morality, how to behave, how to conduct yourself as a human being? And you're going to see, as I suggested in class, this is the tactical or strategic. No, it's a tactical part of Descartes' strategic vision. How do you replace the old world with the new world? As if, by the way, the powers in the old world aren't going to put up a fight and resist it. Well, you're going to see that the metaphor that Descartes has is, as I mentioned in class, is building your new house while you're still living in the old one. And you'll see the 3 rules of morality have to do with how, not only how one should conduct oneself in general, but how a scientist, following the rules of the method that he just laid out in Part 2, should conduct him or herself. Part 4 is the proof of God's existence and the immortality of the soul. Part 4 contains some of the most important philosophic teachings of Descartes, including the cogito ergo sum, the one statement that cannot be doubted, and therefore the foundation of the new science and perhaps the new human identity and even the new religion. Because we'll talk about the structure of the proof of God's existence, and you'll see that in some ways the cogito, the I think therefore I am, is not only the basis of a kind of a reformed theology and the proof of God's existence, it's also the basis of the proof of the immortality of the soul. Now, it's not by accident, I think, that Part 5 follows on Part 4. I love being brilliant. Part 4 comes after Part 5 comes after Part 4. But the content of Part 5 is physics, the material world, and the body, which, as you're going to see, I think what Descartes is going to do is replace the God and the soul with physics and the body, the material universe and the body. And it will also let you know, and this, I should have actually mentioned this in terms of the intellectual background. One of the things that's happening from the time that Machiavelli wrote in the early 1500s is there is, to a certain extent, there was also a kind of a scientific revolution going on too, going back to Copernicus's publication in the 1400s of the doctrine of the heliocentric theory of the solar system. So, from the time of Copernicus on, within European science and religion, there was a debate going on about the structure of the astronomical environment around us. And you know that the predominant theory of the solar system and the Earth's place in the universe was geocentric. That even though there were voices in the ancient world that held a heliocentric view, they were a minority, and following Aristotle, the astronomical or cosmological teaching of the Western world was that the Earth was the center of the solar system and indeed the universe, and so Copernicus, whose works were of course punished and put on the index of prohibited works, that nevertheless was challenged by several developments within astronomy. The most important, by the way, the two most important, and the one, as you'll see, most important for the background of the Discourse on Method, was Johannes Kepler and Galileo. And around the end of the 1500s, Kepler had interned, so to speak, at Tycho Brahe's, the astronomer in Europe, the Dutch astronomer who had the world's best astronomical equipment. And using that astronomical equipment, Kepler managed to actually formulate the 3 laws of planetary motion at the end of the 1500s and the beginning of 1605, when I think published the 3rd law, based simply upon the observation of Mars's orbits, and the formulation of the 3 laws of planetary motion, that the planets travel around the sun in elliptical orbits with the sun at one of the foci of an ellipse. 2, that the square of the distance of a planet from the sun equals the cube of its orbit, actually that's the 3rd law, and that the 2nd law is that the planets sweep out equal periods of time over different parts of lengths of the orbit. All that means is that when the Earth comes closer to the sun, it speeds up, and therefore it covers, but it covers the same distance in terms of secant from the sun to the spread of the orbit. So when the Earth slows down, it takes more time to go around the orbit. When it speeds up, etc. And then the 3rd law is what I just mentioned. Now that became important in terms of both predicting planetary motion, although the debate about whether the Earth was at the center or the sun was still raged until, of course, Galileo. And in 1632, Galileo published his dialogue concerning the 2 world systems, in which he argued for the Copernican system, and indeed partially based upon Kepler's laws of planetary motion. That was important because the Church, as you know, asserted its authority and punished Galileo for publishing this. And you're going to see in Part 5 of the Discourse on Method, and Part 6 of the Discourse on Method, Descartes lets you know very well that he's quite aware of that, and that he has published this work in the light of the lesson he learned from what happened to Galileo. And as you're going to see, that has to do with, and then of course Part 6 is the laying out of the new science and the new world that it may lead to. So if you're following the notes, that was the structure of the Discourse on Method. The nature of the work, and I talked a little bit about this with Socratic Irony. We'd begun a discussion of this yesterday. The Discourse on Method is in some ways a refashioning of the Apology of Socrates, and which means it's both an autobiography and a defense of his way of thinking and a presentation of his method of thinking, and with a Socratic irony in the background. And as we discussed in class, irony can be like tragic irony, like where an unexpected event happens that kind of has a kind of poetic justice to it. But Socratic irony, and when you're being ironic, and it's not just a form of sarcasm, it's a form of dissembling or dishonesty almost. And so the idea that what you're presenting on the surface is not your real teaching. Now, to argue that a work is ironic is difficult because you could say, well, how do you know what an author's teaching is if he's contradicting himself, or how do you know what his deeper teaching is as opposed to there being one on the surface? And in some ways, that's a good question. And so, what might be some evidence of the ironic character of the Discourse on Method? Well, let's walk through a couple of them at the top of the second page of the notes from yesterday. First of all, he says that the purpose of this, I'm not trying to change the world or teach other people how to think. I'm just trying to show you how I taught myself how to think. I think you could say that's ironic in the sense that what he intends to not only teach other people how to think, but teach the human race how to do proper mental work. And even though he embraces the advantages of the 11 sciences of the existing curriculum, in reality, the next page after he destroys these claims by revealing them to be fictional. So it turns out, by the way, that there are 11 sciences that dominate the curriculum of the universities at that time, languages. And he says this is great, gives you access to classical texts. The study of fables, or what we would call fiction. It awakens the mind and judgment. Good books, history, like Plutarch or Livy for that matter, aware of the best minds of past centuries. Eloquence, or the study of rhetoric, which gives you the power and beauty of speech. Poetry, which teaches you the delicacy and sweetness. Mathematics, satisfy curiosity, facilitate arts, and diminish man's labor. Now here I have to say he doesn't mention Archimedes, but Archimedes was probably the greatest practical scientist of the ancient world. He lived in Syracuse. And according to history, Archimedes not only had discovered the displacement of water in a body by when he got into a bathtub, but also had created a crank that could lift ships out of the ocean and all kinds of things. Moral writings like Aristotle's Ethics, exhortations to virtue, theology, how to get to heaven, philosophy, speaking with probability and be admired by the less learned, the motive of pride to some degree, law and medicine, honors and riches, and even an 11th science, which was studied in the universities at that time. Even Kepler was an astrologer, and that's astrology, alchemy, etc. Now, so as you're going to see in the next page, after he lists these sciences, then he actually undermines all other usefulnesses. And it turns out that most of these will be discarded, except for mathematics. But as you're going to see, mathematics isn't just preserved, it's also improved and criticized as it is incorporated into the heart of the scientific method. And just to suggest, by the way, a certain structure in that, of these 11 sciences, if you take the 5 bad ones at the beginning and the 5 bad ones at the end, you're left with the middle, the 6th one, mathematics, which is the only one that will actually turn out to have any value of any of these sciences or arts or intellectual activities. The character of the moral laws in part 3, as you're going to see, he's aware of the fact that you may be publishing and writing and acting in such a way that might get you in trouble. So in some ways you'll see the character of the moral laws isn't just how to live a good life, it's how to live in a dangerous world that could punish you. And as you'll see, the rules are things like obeying the religion and laws of the country where you were born, which is a good idea unless you want to get burned at the stake. And you'll see the middle of the character of the moral laws is actually, I'm going to argue, is actually a reformulation of Machiavelli's The Prince. More about that later. Now, his awareness of the punishing of Galileo, quite explicit about that. In fact, the part 5 is a distillation of a larger work that he was going to publish called Le Monde, the World. But then, as we'll see, here's the passage in particular that I want to refer to at the beginning of part 6. But it is now 3 years, and so he writes part 5, which contains his physics and his materialistic medicine. And you'll see the question that he raises at the end of part 6 is the freedom of the mind and the ability to separate the mind from the body. And there's a big difference of opinion in Descartes' interpretation, which we'll get to eventually. As to Descartes really thinks the mind is separable from the body. There are different interpretations in that respect, and Descartes will give you some hint himself. But at any rate, at the beginning of part 6, he says, "But it is now 3 years since I completed the treatise containing all these things, and I began to review it in order to put it into the hands of a publisher, when I learned that people to whom I defer, and whose authority over my actions cannot be less than that of my reason over my thoughts," the Catholic Church, that is, "had disapproved of a certain opinion in the realm of physics, published a short time before by someone else." And you might look at the helpful footnote, which at the end of page 32, which I already referred to, the punishment of Galileo, concerning which, now listen to the very careful wording of this language, "concerning which I do not wish to say that I was in agreement, but rather that I had found nothing in it before their censuring of it that I could imagine to be prejudicial either to religion or to the state, nor had I found anything that would have stopped me from writing it, had reason persuaded me of it. And this made me fear that I might likewise find upon my opinions, some of which I was mistaken, notwithstanding the great care that I had taken to accept into my set of beliefs any new opinions for which I did not have very certain demonstrations, and never to write anything that could turn to somewhat disadvantage. This was sufficient to make me change the resolution I had made to publish them." So, for an author to say, I was going to publish something, but then decided not to because somebody else who published something that I won't say that I agreed with, but which I found nothing that I disagreed with, I changed my mind. That seems to be presenting a certain kind of irony about his intentions. And then, as we discussed in class, the proof of God's existence and the immortality of the soul. Because you could say, all right, on part 3 and part 4, of all the parts of the Discourse on Method, you think, why are they in a treatise on how to conduct your reason scientifically? Why do you need moral laws in order to do that? And why do you need God's existence and the immortality of the soul? Descartes will provide a formal reason for that. But as we discussed in class yesterday, there could be possibilities why he includes a proof of God's existence in a small treatise or tract on scientific reasoning. And to that we'll turn in our next discussion.